The sound of thread pulling through flesh was the only noise in the midnight chapel, steady and deliberate as a seamstress working Sunday linen. But this was no ordinary sewing. In a small wooden church perched on the edge of the Colorado Territory, sometime in the autumn of 1852, a man's screams had been silenced not by mercy, but by needle and twine. His lips, once quick to command and curse, were now sealed shut with horsehair thread, each stitch drawn tight enough to make the skin pucker and weep. And when the bell rope was finally pulled, it wasn't to call the faithful to prayer, it was to display what happens when patience runs dry and vengeance finds its voice. The stakes were absolute. Only one man would descend from that bell tower alive, and it wouldn't be the master. This is the story of how silence became a weapon, and a church became a gallows. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of linseed oil and beeswax hung thick in the air, clinging to the rough-hewn pews and the worn floorboards of the Summit Ridge Chapel. It was a small structure, barely large enough to hold 40 souls, built from lodgepole pine and river stone at the edge of the Colorado Territory where the mountains met the plains. The year was 1852, and this church served a scattered community of ranchers, prospectors, and those who claimed dominion over others. Tonight, the chapel held only 2 men. One KN knelt in prayer. The other stood behind him with thread and needle, hands steady as stone. The stakes were carved into the silence itself. By dawn, one of these men would be discovered. The other would be gone, vanished into the wilderness like smoke through timber. But the mark left behind would echo for generations, a tale too dark for Sunday sermons yet too compelling to forget. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and dry grass, the kind of wind that whispers across empty land and makes even the bravest rancher check his doors twice. Inside, a single lantern flickered on the altar, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted like accusing fingers. The pews stood empty, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Above, the bell tower rose into darkness, its rope hanging slack, waiting. Imagine standing in that doorway, feeling the cold mountain air press against your back while the warm glow of lamplight beckons you forward. Would you step inside, drawn by curiosity, or would you turn away, sensing that some prayers are not meant to be overheard? The clock in the rectory, just beyond the sanctuary wall, ticked toward midnight. Its rhythm was steady, indifferent, marking time as it always had, unaware that tonight it was counting down to something irreversible. The man kneeling at the altar was Thornton Blackwell, owner of the Blackwell Estate, a sprawling cattle operation that stretched across 3 valleys. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by sun and wind into hard angles. His hands, clasped before him now in supplication, were the same hands that had signed bills of sale, marked ledgers, and struck flesh without hesitation. He prided himself on order, on discipline, on the notion that some men were born to rule and others to serve. Tonight he had come to the chapel alone, as he did every Saturday, to cleanse his conscience before Sunday services. But he was not alone. Behind him, moving with the silence of someone who had learned long ago that survival depended on invisibility, stood a man named Silas. He had no last name recorded in any ledger, no birthplace anyone acknowledged, no age that anyone cared to mark. He had been bought at auction in St. Louis 7 years prior, purchased along with 3 others to work the Blackwell cattle drives and tend the estate's endless demands. His hands, calloused and scarred, had mended fences, branded livestock, hauled water, and broken horses. Those same hands now held a curved needle and a length of waxed horsehair thread, the kind used to repair saddles and harnesses. Silas had watched Thornton Blackwell kneel at this altar every Saturday for 6 months. He had watched the man bow his head, murmur words meant for God, then rise and return to the estate where cruelty resumed with Sunday breakfast. The hypocrisy had burned slowly in Silas, like coals banked overnight, waiting for wind to turn them into flame. Tonight, the wind had come. The needle gleamed in the lamplight, its point sharp enough to pierce leather. Silas tested it once against his thumb, feeling the prick, watching a bead of blood rise dark and honest. He thought of his grandmother, who had sewn quilts by candlelight in a place so far away it felt like another world. She had taught him that every stitch carries intention, that thread can bind or it can heal, depending on the hand that guides it. Tonight, it would bind. Thornton Blackwell's voice rose in prayer, a low murmur that filled the small chapel with the cadence of confession. He spoke of gratitude, of providence, of the burdens of leadership. He did not speak of the scars on Silas's back, nor the woman sold south when she became inconvenient, nor the boy who had tried to run and been dragged back behind a horse until the dust turned red. Those details were not part of Thornton's prayers. They were simply the cost of doing business in a land where men like him made the rules. Silas moved closer, his footsteps absorbed by the wood floor, worn smooth by years of Sunday congregations. The lantern flickered, and for a moment the chapel seemed to hold its breath. The wind outside stilled. The clock's ticking grew louder, each second a hammer strike against the anvil of inevitability. Thornton Blackwell never heard Silas approach. He was too deep in his own voice, too secure in the assumption that this space, this holy ground, belonged to him as surely as his cattle and his land. When the rope looped over his head and pulled tight against his throat, his prayer turned into a choked gasp. His hands flew up, clawing at the cord, but Silas had learned knots from years of wrangling livestock, and this knot held fast. The struggle was brief. Thornton's strength, legendary on the estate, meant nothing when leverage and surprise belonged to another. Within moments he sagged forward, not unconscious but subdued, his breath coming in ragged pulls through his nose. Silas knelt beside him, close enough now to see the veins standing out on the man's neck, the wild terror in his eyes. For a long moment, neither man moved. The chapel returned to silence, broken only by Thornton's labored breathing and the faint creak of the bell tower above. Silas reached into his pocket and withdrew the needle and thread. He held them up so Thornton could see, the lantern light catching the waxed cord and making it shine like spider silk. Silas's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, almost gentle. It carried the weight of 7 years, of countless indignities, of words swallowed and rage banked. He said, "You've spoken enough for a lifetime, Mr. Blackwell. Tonight, you listen." Thornton's eyes widened, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. He tried to speak, to bargain, to command, but the rope held his throat at just the right tension. No words came, only a strangled wheeze that sounded almost like a plea. Silas threaded the needle with steady hands. The horsehair slid through the eye, smooth and true. He tested the length, measuring it between his fingers the way his grandmother had taught him, ensuring there was enough to finish the work without waste. Outside, a coyote called across the plains, its voice rising and falling in a song older than any prayer spoken in this chapel. The first stitch would be the hardest. After that, muscle memory would take over, the same rhythm used to repair tack and mend torn canvas. Silas leaned closer, the needle poised, and Thornton Blackwell understood at last that some reckonings cannot be prayed away. The clock struck midnight, the bell tower waited, and in the flickering lamplight of Summit Ridge Chapel, silence prepared to take its revenge. The Blackwell estate sprawled across the western slope of Summit Ridge like a kingdom carved from sagebrush and ambition. 3,000 acres of grazing land, 200 head of cattle, and a main house built from timber hauled over the mountains at great expense. Thornton Blackwell had arrived in the Colorado Territory in 1847, one of the first to stake a claim when the land opened to settlement. He brought with him money inherited from his father's textile mills back east, a vision of empire, and an unshakable belief that some men were destined to build while others were meant to serve. By 1852, the Blackwell name carried weight. Thornton sat on the territorial council, his voice shaping laws that governed thousands of square miles. He attended church every Sunday, his wife Genevieve beside him in pressed calico, their presence a testament to respectability and order. Neighbors spoke of him with a mixture of respect and caution, the way one might speak of a mountain, impressive but dangerous if you got too close. But empires are not built by one man alone. Behind every fence post driven into rocky soil, behind every calf branded and every wagon loaded, stood those whose names appeared only in ledgers, their lives reduced to columns of figures. The Blackwell estate operated on the labor of 7 individuals who had no choice in their presence there. They lived in a low structure behind the main house, a building with a dirt floor and walls that leaked wind. They rose before dawn and worked until darkness swallowed the land, their lives a rhythm of command and compliance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Silas had been among them for 7 years, purchased in St. Louis for $800, a sum Thornton recorded in his account book with the same care he used for livestock. The bill of sale described Silas as male, approximately 25 years, sound of body, experienced in animal husbandry and general labor. It did not mention that Silas could read, a skill his grandmother had risked everything to teach him. It did not note that he possessed a memory sharp enough to recall every slight, every injustice, every moment when dignity was stripped away like bark from a tree. Working alongside Silas were others, each carrying their own stories, their own scars. There was Colleen, who had been born free in New Orleans but tricked onto a riverboat and sold north, her protests dismissed as hysteria. There was Dominic, whose back bore the pattern of a whip applied with methodical precision, a reminder of what happened when you looked a master in the eye. There was Evelyn, who sang while she worked, spirituals that carried messages only those who needed to hear them could understand. The power dynamics at the Blackwell estate were absolute and unchallenged. Thornton ruled with a combination of paternalistic speeches and swift punishment. He spoke often of duty, of the natural order, of how fortunate his workers were to have steady food and shelter. He ignored the fact that the food was scraps, the shelter barely standing, and the work relentless enough to age a person a decade in a single year. Genevieve Blackwell, Thornton's wife, occupied a peculiar space in this hierarchy. She was mistress of the house, her word law within the domestic sphere, yet she herself was bound by the expectations of marriage and society. She ran the household with tight efficiency, her instructions delivered in clipped sentences that brooked no argument. To the outside world she appeared the model of frontier womanhood, capable and devout, but those who worked closest to her knew the truth, that she saw them not as people, but as extensions of her will, tools to be used and discarded when they broke. The Blackwell offspring, 2 sons in their late teens, had absorbed their father's worldview with the ease of those born to privilege. They rode the estate like young lords, quick to criticize and slow to acknowledge effort. They carried pistols on their hips and bravado in their voices, the kind of dangerous confidence that comes from never facing real consequences. Into this carefully constructed hierarchy, Silas moved with outward compliance and inward calculation. He had learned early that survival required 2 faces, one that obeyed and one that remembered. He watched everything. He noted which floorboards creaked in the main house, which hinges needed oil, which routines never varied. He observed Thornton's Saturday ritual, the solitary walk to Summit Ridge Chapel, the hour spent in prayer, the return under cover of darkness. For months, Silas had considered possibilities. Escape was the obvious choice, but the territory was vast and unforgiving, patrolled by men who hunted runaways for bounty and sport. Resistance seemed futile when facing armed men backed by law and custom, yet doing nothing meant accepting that this would be his life until his body gave out, discarded like a worn-out horse. The turning point came on a Thursday in late September. Thornton had sold a young woman named Zoe, claiming she was needed elsewhere but really ridding himself of someone who had become inconvenient after Genevieve grew suspicious. Zoe had been Callan's sister, the only family she had left. When the wagon pulled away, Callan collapsed in the yard, her grief so raw it seemed to tear the air itself. Thornton watched from the porch, his expression unchanged. When Callan's wails continued, he stepped down and struck her across the face, hard enough to split her lip. "Control yourself," he said, his voice flat. "You'll disturb Mrs. Blackwell." Then he walked back inside, leaving Callan bleeding in the dirt. Silas helped her to her feet, guiding her to the quarters while Dominic and Evelyn stood watch. That night, huddled in the dim space lit by a single candle, the 4 of them spoke in whispers. Not of escape. Not of running, but of something else, something that had been building like pressure in a sealed pot. Callan's voice was hoarse when she finally said it. "We can't kill them all, but we can make one answer for all of them." The words hung in the air, dangerous and intoxicating. Evelyn's eyes widened, but she did not object. Dominic nodded slowly, his scarred back a testament to why such thoughts took root. And Silas, who had spent 7 years watching and waiting, felt something shift inside him like a key turning in a lock. The planning began that night, conducted in stolen moments between chores, in glances exchanged across the yard, in songs whose lyrics carried double meanings. They chose Saturday, when Thornton would be alone in the chapel. They chose tools that would not be missed, a rope, a needle, thread. They chose silence as their weapon, and the bell tower as their stage. Imagine being part of that conversation, sitting in that dim quarters, knowing that what you decided next would change everything. Would you have agreed, risking everything for a single act of defiance? Or would you have counseled patience, hoping for a better opportunity that might never come? By the time October arrived, every detail had been rehearsed in whispers. Colleen would create a distraction at the main house, a fire in the kitchen that would demand attention. Dominic and Evelyn would ensure no one left the estate, and Silas would walk the half-mile to Summit Ridge Chapel, where Thornton Blackwell knelt every Saturday, secure in his power and blind to the reckoning approaching from behind. The hierarchy that had seemed unshakable was about to invert. The man who commanded would be silenced, the man who had been voiceless would speak through action, and the chapel that had witnessed so many prayers for forgiveness would host something far older than Christianity, justice served with needle and thread. The week leading up to that final Saturday unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Cattle were moved to fresh pasture. Fences were repaired where autumn winds had loosened posts. The main house received its weekly cleaning, every surface scrubbed and polished until it gleamed. To any observer, the Blackwell estate operated with its usual ruthless efficiency, a machine well-oiled and humming. But beneath the surface, small things began to shift. Silas worked with a focus that drew no attention yet missed nothing. He repaired tack in the barn, his hands moving with practiced ease, while his mind mapped distances and timelines. He noted that Thornton left for the chapel at precisely 8 o'clock each Saturday evening, his lantern visible across the dark prairie until it disappeared into the small wooden structure. He observed that no one followed, that Genevieve considered this her husband's private communion with God, not to be interrupted. On Monday of that week, a traveling preacher passed through Summit Ridge, staying overnight at the Blackwell estate, as was customary for men of the cloth. Over supper, he spoke of signs and wonders, of how the territory was changing, how civilization was bringing order to chaos. Thornton nodded approvingly, refilling the preacher's glass with imported whiskey. But later, in the quarters, Evelyn reported what she had overheard while serving the meal. The preacher had also spoken of unrest, of rumors filtering up from Kansas and Missouri, of those who refused their station and paid terrible prices. He had mentioned a man found hanging from a barn rafter, whether by his own hand or another's no one could say. The story was meant as warning, but to those listening in the dim quarters, it sounded like possibility. Before we continue, I want to know, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. And if stories like this pull you in, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what follows is not just history, but a question about what any of us might do when patience runs out. On Tuesday, a ranch hand from a neighboring property stopped by to trade news and tobacco. He mentioned that Summit Ridge Chapel had been having problems with its bell, the rope fraying from age and weather. Thornton had promised to replace it but had not gotten around to the task. The bell still rang, but the rope showed wear, strands separating like the threads of something coming undone. Silas absorbed this detail without comment. That evening, he walked past the chapel on an errand to retrieve a stray calf, allowing himself a brief detour to examine the building. The door stood unlocked. As it always did, frontier hospitality extended even to houses of worship. Inside, the rope hung as described, worn but functional, strong enough to ring the bell but showing its age in dozens of small ways. He did not linger. To be caught inside the chapel without purpose would raise questions he could not afford, but in those few moments he memorized the layout, the position of the pews, the height of the bell tower, the way sound would carry across the empty prairie. Every detail was a piece of the plan falling into place. Wednesday brought rain, a cold autumn downpour that turned the roads to mud and kept everyone close to shelter. Work continued but at a slower pace, everyone moving through the drizzle with heads down and shoulders hunched. In the main house, Genevieve complained about the damp seeping through the walls, her voice sharp as she directed Colin and Evelyn to place pots under leaks and stuff rags into gaps. That evening, after the work was done and the household had retired, the four conspirators gathered in the quarters. Rain drummed on the roof, providing cover for their low voices. Dominic had acquired the needle, palmed from the tack room where such tools were common. Evelyn had waxed a length of horsehair thread until it was stiff and strong. Colin had practiced creating small fires that looked accidental, testing how quickly cloth caught flame and how long it took for smoke to draw attention. Silas laid out the timing one more time, speaking in a whisper barely audible above the rain. Saturday, 8 o'clock, when Thornton walked to the chapel. 8:15, when Colin would start the kitchen fire. 8:30, when Silas would have finished his work. By 9, before anyone thought to check the chapel, it would be over. Evelyn asked the question they had all been avoiding. And after? When they find him? Silas met her gaze steadily. Then we scatter. Separately. Different directions. They can't chase all of us at once. It was not a perfect plan. It was not even a good plan, but it was the only plan they had, born from desperation and fury, and the knowledge that doing nothing meant dying slowly under the weight of someone else's boot. Imagine sitting in that circle, rain pounding overhead, knowing that in 3 days you would either be free or dead. Would you have the courage to see it through? Or would fear convince you to warn the very people who held you captive, hoping for mercy that had never been offered before? Thursday was quiet, almost eerily so. The rain had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and sharp-edged. Thornton rode out to inspect his fences, his sons accompanying him, their voices carrying across the prairie in bursts of laughter. They returned at dusk, satisfied with what they owned, confident in what they controlled. That night, Silas lay awake on his thin bedroll, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his grandmother, about the story she had told of their people before the ships, before the chains, before the ledgers. She had spoken of justice as something patient, something that waited for the right moment to strike. He had not understood then. He understood now. Friday arrived with cold wind and clear skies. Genevieve hosted a tea for neighboring women, a social event that required the quarter's full attention. Colin and Evelyn served cakes and poured drinks, moving through the parlor like ghosts, while the women discussed weather and gossip and the challenges of bringing civilization to rough country. One of the visitors, a woman named Mrs. Pemberton, mentioned that her husband had been troubled by dreams lately, visions of violence that left him unsettled. Genevieve dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "The frontier affects men in strange ways," she said. "They see savagery in every shadow." The irony was not lost on Colin, standing in the corner with a teapot, her face carefully blank. She wondered if Mrs. Pemberton's husband sensed something in the air, some shift in the unspoken currents that govern this territory. Or perhaps he was simply another man whose guilt manifested in dreams because it could not surface during waking hours. That evening, as the sun set and the household prepared for supper, Silas checked the needle one final time. It was hidden in a fold of canvas in the barn, along with the thread and a coil of rope borrowed from the tack room. Everything was ready. All that remained was the waiting. Saturday morning dawned cold and brilliant, the kind of day that makes the mountains look close enough to touch. Thornton was in good spirits, joking with his sons over breakfast, making plans for Sunday services. He would lead the prayer, as he often did, offering thanks for prosperity and asking for continued blessings. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Silas worked mechanically, his body performing tasks while his mind rehearsed every step of what was to come. Dominic watched the road, ensuring no unexpected visitors arrived. Evelyn prepared kindling for the kitchen fire, innocent bundles of dry grass and wood shavings that would catch flame at a touch. Colleen moved through the day like someone already gone, her eyes distant but her hands steady. As evening approached, the temperature dropped. Frost would come tonight, the first of the season, a reminder that winter was not far behind. Thornton dressed for his weekly chapel visit, donning a heavy coat and lighting his lantern. He kissed Genevieve on the cheek, told his sons to behave, and stepped out into the gathering darkness. Silas watched from the barn as the lantern light bobbed across the prairie, growing smaller with distance. He waited 5 minutes, then 10, ensuring Thornton had time to settle into his prayers. Then he reached for the canvas bundle, checked its contents one final time, and stepped out into the cold. The walk to Summit Ridge Chapel took 15 minutes at a steady pace. The wind carried the scent of coming frost and distant pine. Above, stars began to emerge, cold and indifferent. Behind him, smoke would soon rise from the Blackwell kitchen, drawing attention inward while he moved outward. His footsteps were silent on the frost-hard ground. The chapel appeared ahead, its window glowing with lamplight, the bell tower rising against the darkening sky. Inside, Thornton Blackwell knelt at the altar, his voice a low murmur of prayer, his back to the door. Silas's hand closed around the rope in his bundle. The needle felt light, almost insignificant, yet it carried the weight of 7 years. He thought about all the times he had bitten back words, swallowed rage, bowed his head when every instinct screamed to fight. Tonight, patience transformed into action. He pushed open the chapel door. It made no sound, well-oiled hinges swinging smooth. Thornton's prayer continued, uninterrupted. The lantern flickered. The bell tower waited. And Silas stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sealed both their fates. The planning had begun 6 weeks earlier, long before that final Saturday, long before the needle found its purpose. It started not with violence but with observation, the kind of patient watching that those who live under constant scrutiny learn to perfect. Silas had spent 7 years cataloging Thornton Blackwell's routines, noting every pattern, every predictable moment when the master's guard came down. Saturday evenings were sacred to Thornton, his weekly communion with God performed in solitude. He would walk to Summit Ridge Chapel alone, carrying his lantern and his Bible, his footsteps crunching across the prairie grass with the confidence of a man who owned not just land but the very air above it. He never varied his route, never checked behind him, never considered that someone might follow with intentions darker than prayer. In the quarters behind the main house, where 7 souls lived in a space meant for storage, conversations happened in layers. Surface talk about weather and work, the kind of chatter that meant nothing if overheard. But underneath, in glances and gestures and words chosen with surgical precision, another conversation ran deeper. It was in this hidden language that the plan took shape. Colleen had been the first to speak it aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the darkness after Zoe was sold away. "We can't run. They'll hunt us down one by one. We can't fight. They have guns and law on their side. But we can make them remember. We can leave a mark they can't scrub away." Dominic had nodded slowly, his hands tracing the scars on his back through his shirt, remembering the whip and the man who wielded it. One mark. One message. Something so loud they can't ignore it. Evelyn had added her voice, soft but steady. "It has to be him. Not the sons, not the wife. Thornton, the head. Cut that off and the body doesn't know which way to turn." Silas had listened, his mind already racing through possibilities. Violence was easy, a knife in the dark, a rifle from distance. But those were common frontier deaths. Accidents happened. Men fell from horses, drowned in rivers, got caught in stampedes. To make this count, to ensure the story lived beyond the moment, it needed to be something more. Something that would force people to confront what they preferred to ignore. The idea came to him 3 weeks before that final Saturday, while mending a bridle in the barn. The needle in his hand, curved and sharp, designed to push through tough leather. The thread, waxed horsehair, strong enough to hold saddles together under the strain of a running horse. And the thought, sudden and complete, of what those tools could do to flesh instead of hide. He had tested the concept carefully, privately. A scrap of cured leather, similar in thickness to skin. The needle punched through with firm pressure but not excessive force. The thread held without breaking. 20 stitches to close a 6-inch tear. He counted them, memorizing the rhythm. Pierce, pull, knot. Pierce, pull, knot. A meditation of sorts, each motion bringing him closer to a decision he could not take back. The others noticed his distraction. Evelyn asked one evening as they sat outside the quarters watching the sun set over the mountains, what occupied his thoughts so completely. He told her, speaking in the careful code they had developed, "I've been thinking about silence, how it's forced on some and chosen by others, what it would mean to reverse that." She understood immediately, her eyes widening with a mixture of horror and recognition. That's not just killing. That's making a statement. Exactly, Silas replied. They talk about us like we're animals, like we don't understand language or pain or injustice. What if we showed them what it's like to have your voice taken away? Not with a gag that can be removed, but with something permanent. Something that requires answering questions like how and why, instead of just who. The plan evolved through September, each detail refined through whispered conferences. They would need multiple elements to succeed. First, a distraction to keep the household occupied while Silas was at the chapel. Cullen volunteered for this, having learned enough about the kitchen to know exactly which pot of grease, if left unattended near the stove, would begin smoking within minutes. Not a dangerous fire, but enough to create panic and demand immediate attention. Second, they needed to ensure no one would interrupt Thornton's prayer time. This was easier than it seemed. Genevieve considered her husband's Saturday devotions sacrosanct, a time when his spiritual needs took precedence over household matters. She would not send anyone to disturb him, not even for a kitchen fire. The sons were predictable too, more interested in cards and whiskey than their father's religious observances. Third, and most crucial, Silas needed time. Not just to subdue Thornton, but to complete the work properly. Rushed stitches would tear, would fail to make the point. This required at least 30 minutes of uninterrupted focus. The chapel's isolation worked in their favor. Located half a mile from the nearest occupied building, screams would not carry far, and the thick log walls would muffle most sounds. Dominic had contributed a crucial observation from his time working on other estates before being sold to Blackwell. Masters pray loudest when they feel guilty. The worse they've been during the week, the longer they spend on their knees. Last week was hard. This week will be harder. Give him another week of being himself, and he'll be in that chapel for an hour easy. They had tested this theory through careful observation. After particularly brutal days, when Thornton's temper ran hot and his punishments severe, his Saturday prayers extended well past the usual time. It was as if he believed God operated on a transactional basis, that enough contrition could balance the scales of his weekday cruelty. The week before the final Saturday, Silas made his preparations with methodical care. He acquired the needle from the tack room, where such tools were numerous enough that one going missing would not be noticed. He cut a length of horsehair thread from a fresh spool, waxing it himself with beeswax saved from candle drippings. He tested the rope he would use, checking its strength by suspending his own weight from a barn rafter, ensuring it would not fail at the critical moment. He also prepared his route, walking to the chapel 3 times during that week on various pretexts, memorizing every rise and hollow in the terrain, every place where he might be visible from the main house or the road. He identified a path that followed a shallow creek bed for much of the distance, keeping him below the sightline of anyone who might glance out a window. On Wednesday of that final week, a moment of doubt crept in. Silas sat in the quarters after dark, the needle hidden in his bedroll, and wondered if he was becoming the very thing he despised. Was this justice or merely revenge dressed in righteous clothing? Would silencing one voice actually change anything? Or would it simply add his name to the long list of those who had tried and failed to push back against an immovable system? Evelyn found him sitting there, staring at nothing. She sat beside him without speaking for a long moment before saying, "You're thinking it's wrong." "I'm thinking it won't change anything," Silas replied. "Tomorrow there will be another Thornton, another estate, another 7 people living in quarters meant for animals." "Maybe," Evelyn conceded. "But tomorrow those 7 people will know that someone stood up. They'll know that the masters can bleed, can be brought down, can be made to understand what they've inflicted on others. That's not nothing. That's a seed, Silas. What grows from it we can't control, but we can plant it." Her words settled something in him, a sense that this action was not about changing the world entire, but about refusing to let his own world remain unchanged. He could not free everyone, could not topple every unjust structure, but he could ensure that one man, who had wielded power without conscience, would face an accounting. Friday evening, the night before that final Saturday, the 4 conspirators gathered one last time. They spoke their roles aloud, each person confirming their part. Colleen would start the kitchen fire at precisely 8:15, giving Silas 15 minutes to reach the chapel after Thornton. Dominic would position himself near the main house to monitor the response, ready to create additional distraction if needed. Evelyn would stay in the quarters, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, ensuring that anyone who looked for the others would find at least one person going about ordinary evening tasks. Silas would walk to the chapel carrying his tools wrapped in canvas. He would enter quietly, would subdue Thornton with the rope, would complete his work with the needle and thread, and then would deliver the final statement by raising the body into the bell tower. The bell would ring once, pulled by the weight of a falling body, announcing to the prairie that something had changed. They all knew the risks. Discovery meant death, probably not quick, certainly not merciful. Even success meant exile, meant becoming fugitives in a territory that offered few places to hide, and many people eager to collect bounties. But they also knew that staying silent meant a different kind of death, the slow erosion of self that came from swallowing every indignity, bowing to every command, accepting that their lives had no value beyond the work they could perform. As they separated that night, returning to their bedrolls, Silas felt a strange calm settle over him. The decision was made, the tools were ready, the time had come. He thought of his grandmother one last time, remembering her words about patience. She had been right. Patience was not passivity. It was preparation. It was waiting for the moment when action would have the greatest impact. That moment had arrived. Tomorrow, when Thornton Blackwell walked to Summit Ridge Chapel to cleanse his conscience, he would find that some stains run too deep for prayer to wash away. And Silas, who had been silent for 7 years, would speak through needle and thread and the tolling of a bell, delivering a message that would echo far beyond one cold October night. Saturday arrived with deceptive gentleness, the kind of autumn day that makes the Colorado Territory feel less like a harsh frontier and more like the promised land settlers dreamed about. The sky stretched endless and blue, the mountains stood sharp against the horizon, and the morning air carried the clean scent of sage and pine. It was the sort of day that made men like Thornton Blackwell feel their power was ordained by nature itself, that their dominion was as permanent as the rocks beneath their boots. But by afternoon the weather began to shift. Clouds gathered in the west, not the heavy thunderheads of summer storms, but thin, high sheets that filtered the sunlight into something cold and metallic. The temperature dropped steadily, and by evening frost warnings whispered through the scattered homesteads. Animals grew restless, horses stamping in their corrals, cattle lowing uneasily in distant pastures. Inside the Blackwell main house, the day unfolded with its usual rigid structure. Breakfast at 6, work assignments distributed by 6:30, midday meal at noon, afternoon chores until sundown. Genevieve supervised the household with her characteristic efficiency, her voice sharp when tasks were performed too slowly, her approval withheld as a matter of principle. The sons lounged through the morning, rode out to check fence lines in the afternoon, and returned with appetites sharpened by cold wind and the certainty of hot food waiting. Thornton himself spent much of the day in his study, reviewing ledgers and correspondence. He wrote letters to business contacts in Denver, calculated profit margins on his cattle, and planned expansions that would push his holdings even further into unclaimed territory. His pen scratched across paper with the same confidence he brought to every aspect of his life, each stroke an assertion of control. In the quarters, Silas moved through his assigned tasks with mechanical precision. He fed horses, mucked stalls, repaired a section of corral fence where winter wind had loosened boards. His hands worked while his mind counted minutes, calculated timing, rehearsed the sequence of actions that would unfold once darkness fell. He spoke little, which drew no attention since he was not a man given to unnecessary words. Colleen prepared the midday meal, her movements in the kitchen practiced and efficient. She noted the position of every pot, every container of grease, every element that would contribute to her 8:15 distraction. While serving the family, she observed their moods, their focus, their likelihood of responding quickly or slowly to crisis. Thornton was distracted by his correspondence, barely acknowledging the food placed before him. Genevieve was irritated by some social slight from a neighboring ranch wife, her attention turned inward on grievances. The sons were simply hungry and bored. dangerous in their idleness but predictable. Dominic spent the afternoon in the barn, his assigned task to organize tack and equipment for winter storage. It was tedious work that put him in perfect position to observe the main house, the quarters, and the road leading to Summit Ridge Chapel. He worked slowly, making the job last, ensuring he would have reason to still be in the barn when evening came. Evelyn washed linens, hauling water, and scrubbing fabric until her hands were raw. She sang while she worked, old spirituals that carried meanings beneath their melodies. Other workers passing by would pause, adding their voices to hers, creating harmonies that rose into the cooling air. To the Blackwells, if they noticed at all, it was simply the sound of contented labor. To those singing, it was communication, affirmation, a way of saying without words that they remained human despite everything designed to make them feel otherwise. As afternoon faded toward evening, the sky continued to darken. The clouds thickened, obscuring the sun hours before sunset. Shadows stretched long and strange across the prairie, making familiar landmarks look foreign. The wind picked up, not howling but persistent, the kind that works its way through every gap in walls and clothing. At 5 o'clock, Genevieve called for early supper, citing the cold and her desire to have the household settled before full darkness. The meal was tense, though the family seemed not to notice. Thornton ate quickly, his mind already on his evening ritual. The sons argued over some trivial matter, their voices loud in the confined space. Genevieve picked at her food, her mood still soured by her afternoon grievances. In the kitchen, Colleen worked with Evelyn to clean dishes and bank the stove for the night. They moved in synchronized silence, two people who had worked together long enough to communicate without words. At one point, their eyes met, a brief moment of acknowledgement. Everything was ready. The kindling was positioned. The grease pot sat where it needed to sit. One small adjustment at the right time, and smoke would billow, creating the exact level of crisis required. By 6:30, the household began its evening routine. The sons retreated to their room with a bottle of whiskey and a deck of cards. Genevieve settled in the parlor with needlework, positioning herself near the stove where lamplight was strongest. Thornton retired to his study to finish a letter, his penmanship growing larger and less controlled as he anticipated his weekly spiritual cleansing. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. First frost would arrive tonight. Everyone could feel it in the air. Cattle would need extra fodder. Horses would need blankets. But those concerns were for tomorrow. Tonight, the Blackwell estate prepared for its Saturday evening rhythm, the master's departure for prayer, the household's quiet evening, the workers' brief respite before another week began. At 7:30, Thornton emerged from his study wearing his heavy coat and carrying his Bible. He paused in the parlor to kiss Genevieve's cheek, a ritual gesture performed without warmth. "I'll return by 9, he said, as he did every Saturday. She nodded without looking up from her needlework. He collected his lantern from the hook by the door, struck a match, and lit the wick. The flame caught and steadied, casting his shadow large against the wall. He opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air that made Genevieve hiss in irritation. Then he stepped out into the gathering darkness, pulling the door shut behind him. From the barn, Dominic watched the lantern light bob across the prairie, a small point of illumination in the growing dark. He counted to 60, then to 100, ensuring Thornton was well away from the house. In the quarters, Silas stood at the window, also watching the light recede. His hand rested on the canvas bundle hidden beneath his coat, feeling the weight of rope and needle and thread. At 8 o'clock, Thornton reached Summit Ridge Chapel. The lantern light disappeared inside, and a faint glow appeared in the window as he lit the altar lamp. He would kneel now, would open his Bible, would begin the prayers that he believed washed away a week's worth of sin. At 8:05, Silas left the quarters. He moved quickly but not frantically, a man on an errand that could be explained if questioned. He carried nothing visible, the canvas bundle secured inside his coat. The cold bit at his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was clear, focused, reduced to a simple sequence of actions that would unfold over the next 30 minutes. At 8:10, he reached the creek bed that would hide his approach. The water ran shallow and clear, barely a trickle between frost-hardened banks. He followed it west, his footsteps silent on the frozen ground. At 8:15, back at the main house, Kalen made her move. She adjusted the grease pot, shifting it slightly closer to the stove's hottest section. She arranged the kindling she had supposedly set aside for morning, positioning it where rising heat would catch it. Then she stepped out of the kitchen, returning to the quarters as if finished with her evening duties. 3 minutes later, smoke began to curl from the kitchen, thin at first, then thicker, carrying the acrid smell of burning grease. Genevieve noticed it first, her head snapping up from her needlework. "What is that smell?" She rose and hurried to the kitchen, finding smoke billowing from the stove area. Her shriek brought the sons running, and within moments, the household was in controlled chaos. Not a real emergency, the fire was small and easily contained, but enough to demand immediate attention and keep everyone occupied. At 8:25, Silas reached Summit Ridge Chapel. He circled it once, ensuring no one else was near, that Thornton's horse was the only one tethered outside. The building sat isolated in the darkness, its single window glowing like a beacon. Inside, he could hear Thornton's voice, a low murmur of prayer and confession. Silas tested the door, unlocked as always. He wrapped his hand around the rope inside his coat, feeling its rough texture against his palm. His other hand found the needle, small and sharp and ready. At 8:30, he pushed the door open. It moved silently on well-oiled hinges, swinging inward to reveal the chapel's interior. Thornton knelt at the altar, his back to the door, his voice raised in prayer. The lamplight created a halo around his head, as if heaven itself was listening. But Silas knew better. Heaven was not in this chapel tonight, only reckoning. Only the long-delayed answer to 7 years of questions. He stepped inside, the rope sliding free from his coat, his footsteps absorbed by the worn wooden floor. Thornton's prayer continued, oblivious. The words spoke of gratitude, of stewardship, of burdens carried with grace. They spoke of everything except truth. Silas moved closer, the rope ready in his hands. Behind him, the door stood open to the cold night air, to the gathering frost, to the sound of wind moving through sage. And ahead of him, still praying, still certain of his righteousness, knelt the man who had never imagined that silence itself could become a weapon. The clock in the distant main house struck 8:30. In the kitchen, smoke was clearing. On the prairie, frost was forming. And in Summit Ridge Chapel, the last prayer of Thornton Blackwell was about to be cut short, his mouth about to be sealed, his voice about to join the chorus of those he had silenced for so long. The rope moved through the air with practiced precision, a loop settling over Thornton Blackwell's head before he registered the presence behind him. His prayer broke mid-sentence, the words fragmenting into confusion as Silas pulled the rope tight around his throat. Not tight enough to strangle. Not yet. But enough to control, to transform the kneeling master into something else entirely. Something vulnerable and afraid. Thornton's hands flew to his neck, fingers clawing at the rope as his body jerked backward. He tried to stand, to turn, to use his size and strength to overcome this sudden attack. But Silas had positioned himself perfectly. 7 years of watching, of studying how Thornton moved, how he fought, how he reacted under pressure, all of that observation condensed into this single moment of absolute control. The struggle was brief but violent. Thornton's boots scraped against the wooden floor, his body twisting as he tried to break free. His weight was considerable, easily 50 pounds more than Silas, and under normal circumstances that advantage would have mattered. But these were not normal circumstances. Silas had surprise, position, and 7 years of compressed rage flowing through his arms with the strength of something beyond mere muscle. Within 30 seconds, Thornton's struggles weakened. The rope was cutting off just enough air to cloud his thinking, to sap his strength without rendering him unconscious. Silas needed him awake, needed him to understand what was happening, needed him to feel every moment of what came next. Unconsciousness would be mercy, and mercy had no place in this chapel tonight. When Thornton's body finally sagged, when his hands dropped from the rope to hang limp at his sides, Silas adjusted his grip. He wrapped the rope around one of the pew supports, creating an anchor point that would hold Thornton in place without requiring constant pressure. The master now knelt not in prayer but in captivity, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wide with a terror he had inflicted countless times but never experienced himself. Silas moved to face him, stepping around to where the lamplight would illuminate his features clearly. He wanted Thornton to see him, to recognize not just his face but his humanity, the personhood that had been denied and dismissed for 7 years. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sounds were Thornton's labored breathing and the wind outside pressing against the chapel walls. Then Silas reached into his coat and withdrew the canvas bundle. He unwrapped it slowly, deliberately, letting each item emerge into the light with theatrical precision. First, the needle, its curved steel catching the lamplight and throwing tiny reflections across the walls. Then the thread, waxed horsehair coiled neat and ready. Thornton's eyes followed each revelation, his face transitioning from confusion to understanding to horror. He tried to speak, but the rope restricted his throat enough that words came out strangled and incomprehensible. Silas watched him struggle for a moment before speaking himself, his voice quiet but carrying perfect clarity in the small space. 7 years, Silas said. 7 years I've listened to you talk. Orders and threats and lectures about duty and natural order. 7 years of your voice filling every space, claiming every conversation, drowning out anything that might challenge your certainty. He held up the needle, turning it slowly in the light. Tonight, you listen. Tonight, your voice belongs to me. Thornton's struggles renewed with desperate intensity. He threw his weight against the rope, trying to snap it or pull free from the pew support. His face flushed deep red, veins standing out on his forehead and neck. Muffled sounds emerged from his throat, pleas or curses impossible to distinguish. But the rope held, and Silas simply waited, letting the man exhaust himself against bonds that would not break. When Thornton finally stilled again, his chest heaving and sweat beading on his face despite the cold, Silas knelt beside him. They were at eye level now, 2 men in a position that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. The master kneeling before the enslaved. The powerful rendered helpless. The order of things inverted in a space that was supposed to be sacred, that was supposed to uphold the very hierarchies now crumbling between these wooden walls. I thought about killing you quick, Silas continued, his tone conversational, almost gentle. A knife would be faster, quieter, less risk of something going wrong. He threaded the needle, pulling the horsehair through the eye with steady hands. But quick doesn't teach anything. Quick lets you escape without understanding. And I need you to understand, Mr. Blackwell. I need you to feel what it's like to have your voice taken away. Thornton's eyes followed the needle, watching as Silas tested the thread's tension as he measured the length between his fingers. The horror in those eyes was profound, a recognition that whatever was about to happen existed outside the bounds of familiar violence. This was not the whip or the brand or the auction block. This was something else entirely. Something personal and permanent and designed specifically for him. Silas leaned closer, close enough to smell the whiskey on Thornton's breath, the wool of his expensive coat, the fear sweat now soaking through his collar. You like to pray, Silas said. You come here every week and talk to God about your burdens, your responsibilities, all the hard decisions you have to make. Do you know what I pray for, Mr. Blackwell? I pray for the strength not to become you. I pray that when I take your voice, I don't also take your soul into myself. He positioned the needle at the corner of Thornton's mouth, the sharp point dimpling the skin without yet breaking it. Thornton tried to jerk his head away, but Silas's free hand clamped around his jaw with iron strength. The years of physical labor, of hauling and lifting and enduring, had built a grip that no amount of comfortable living could match. Hold still, Silas commanded, his voice carrying an authority that transcended their supposed stations. The more you fight, the worse this gets. And believe me, Mr. Blackwell, you want this done right. Sloppy stitches tear. They get infected. They hurt worse than clean ones. The first puncture was the hardest, not because of physical resistance, but because of what it represented. The moment the needle pierced Thornton's flesh, breaking through skin and emerging on the other side, a line was crossed that could never be uncrossed. Blood welled around the entry point, a bright bead of red that caught the lamplight like a ruby. Thornton's scream, already throttled by the rope, became something inhuman. His body convulsed, every muscle straining against the inevitable, but Silas's hands remained steady. He pulled the thread through, leaving a tail of horsehair extending from Thornton's lip. Then he positioned the needle for the second puncture, measuring the distance to ensure even spacing. pierce, pull, tie, pierce, pull, tie. The rhythm established itself, each stitch a repetition of the one before. Silas had practiced this sequence on leather scraps, had memorized the motion until it became automatic. But leather did not bleed or twitch or make muffled sounds of agony. Leather did not have eyes that pleaded with desperate intensity for mercy that would not come. By the fifth stitch, Thornton's struggles had weakened to tremors. Shock was setting in, his body's attempt to escape what it could not prevent. Silas worked carefully, ensuring each stitch was clean and tight. The thread pulled Thornton's lips together incrementally, each new puncture narrowing the opening through which breath and sound could escape. At the 10th stitch, halfway through the work, Silas paused. He wiped blood from Thornton's face with a handkerchief, an oddly tender gesture in the midst of horror. "I want you to remember something," he said, his voice cutting through Thornton's diminishing consciousness. "Every person you've ever owned had a voice you never heard, had thoughts you never considered, had dreams you crushed without noticing. You took our voices by never listening. I'm taking yours by making it impossible to speak. There's a symmetry to that, don't you think?" Thornton's response was a wet, bubbling sound. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with blood and sweat. His eyes, once so certain and commanding, now held nothing but terror and incomprehension. How had this happened? How had the order he believed immutable suddenly collapsed? How had the natural hierarchy he preached revealed itself as nothing more than force and law, both of which could fail when least expected? Silas resumed his work. Stitch 11, 12, 13. The needle moved with mechanical precision, the thread following in its wake. Thornton's lips, once mobile and expressive, instruments of command and condemnation, were being sewn into permanent silence. The horsehair thread was strong, designed to withstand the stresses of hard use. It would not break easily. It would not come undone without deliberate cutting. By the 15th stitch, Thornton's lips were nearly sealed. Only a small opening remained at one corner, enough for shallow breathing but not enough for coherent speech. Blood had run down his chin, staining his collar and coat. His face had gone pale beneath the flush of exertion, his body trying to process trauma it was never designed to handle. Silas tied off the final stitch with a surgeon's care, ensuring the knot was secure. He trimmed the excess thread with a small knife, leaving just enough tail that the stitches could be examined, counted, their precision admired or condemned, depending on who discovered them. Then he sat back on his heels, studying his work in the lamplight. Thornton Blackwell's mouth was now a line of black thread against pale, blood-streaked skin. His lips had swollen around the stitches, the body's inflammatory response beginning even as the work was completed. His breathing came in short gasps through his nose, each inhalation whistling slightly. His eyes, the only part of his face still capable of expression, burned with hatred and terror and disbelief. "There," Silas said softly, "now you know what it's like. To have words trapped inside. To want to speak but be unable. To feel your voice taken away by someone who has the power to do it and the will to follow through." He stood, his knees cracking from the prolonged kneeling. His hands were steady despite the blood on them, despite what they had just done. He walked to the window, looking out at the dark prairie. Somewhere in the distance, the Blackwell estate sat with its kitchen fire now extinguished, its household settling back into routine after the minor crisis. They would not check the chapel. They would not interrupt Thornton's prayers. They had been trained too well to respect his Saturday ritual, to leave him alone with his God and his conscience. But God was not in this chapel tonight, if God had ever been here at all. Only two men remained, one who had held power and one who had taken it back in the most visceral way imaginable. Silas turned from the window and looked at Thornton, seeing not a master but a man revealed as fundamentally breakable, fundamentally human, despite all his pretensions otherwise. "The bell tower awaits," Silas said, his voice carrying a finality that made Thornton's eyes widen further. "But first, I want you to think about every voice you silenced, every plea you ignored, every cry for mercy you dismissed. Think about them as I prepare your final audience with this community. Because when that bell rings, Mr. Blackwell, everyone will come. And they'll see what happens when silence itself becomes a weapon." He moved to untie the rope from the pew support, preparing for the next phase. Thornton's body tensed. A final surge of survival instinct, demanding he fight, run, do anything to change what was coming. But the rope remained tight around his throat, and his mouth remained sealed, and his voice remained trapped behind thread and swollen flesh. The confrontation was over. The power had shifted, and in a small wooden chapel on the edge of the Colorado Territory, justice and vengeance had merged into something that would be debated for generations. Was this righteousness? Was this merely cruelty answered with cruelty? Or was it something else entirely, something that existed in the space between those easy categories, something that forced uncomfortable questions about power and humanity and what people become when pushed past the point of endurance? Silas did not have answers to those questions. He had only the rope in his hands, the needle and thread stained with blood, and a bell tower waiting to announce to the world that tonight, in this place, the order of things had been challenged in a way that could not be ignored or explained away. The clock somewhere distant struck 9. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the shutters. And Thornton Blackwell, master of 3,000 acres and 200 head of cattle, knelt with his mouth sewn shut and his eyes streaming tears, about to ascend to his final pulpit whether he wished it or not. The bell rope hung in the tower like a serpent waiting to strike, its frayed end swaying gently in the draft that filtered through gaps in the wooden walls. Silas stood at the base of the narrow ladder that led upward, the rough hemp gripped in one hand while the other maintained tension on the rope still securing Thornton's throat. The master's body had gone beyond resistance now, moving with mechanical compliance born from shock and oxygen deprivation. His eyes remained open, tracking Silas's movements with an animal awareness that recognized predator and prey, but no longer processed complex thought. Getting Thornton up the ladder would be the most dangerous part of the plan. The tower was barely 6 feet square at its base, narrowing as it rose toward the bell housing 15 feet above. The ladder was old, its rungs worn smooth by years of use when someone needed to maintain the bell or check the mounting. One wrong move, one slip, and both men could fall. Silas could not allow that. The message he intended to send required Thornton to reach the top, required the bell to ring, required the body to be displayed where it could not be missed. He adjusted the rope, creating a longer lead that would allow him to guide Thornton upward while maintaining control. Then he positioned himself behind the master, speaking in a low voice despite knowing the words would barely register. "You're going to climb now, one rung at a time. If you fall, I fall with you, and neither of us gets what we want. You want to live a few minutes longer, I want you to reach the top. So we're going to work together one last time." Thornton's response was a wet, gurgling sound from behind his sealed lips. Blood had congealed around the stitches, creating a dark line across his lower face like war paint applied by a mad artist. His hands, when Silas freed them from the rope binding them behind his back, shook violently, but they reached for the ladder rungs when directed, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. The ascent was agonizing. Each rung required negotiation, coordination between two men who occupied fundamentally different realities. Silas climbed behind Thornton, one hand on the rope, the other braced against the ladder or the master's back, providing just enough support to keep the ascent moving, without allowing any possibility of escape or resistance. The wood creaked beneath their combined weight, and dust shaken loose from the rafters drifted down in the lamplight filtering up from below. Halfway up, Thornton's strength faltered. His hand slipped from a rung, his body sagging backward into Silas. For a moment they hung there, suspended between floor and bell, the entire plan teetering on whether Silas could absorb the weight and recover balance. His arms screamed with effort, his legs locked against the ladder, every muscle engaged in keeping them both from plummeting. "Move," Silas commanded through gritted teeth. "One more rung, then another. You've climbed harder things than this ladder, Mr. Blackwell. Every back you stepped on to get where you are, those were harder climbs. This is just wood and rope. Move." Whether the words penetrated or whether some survival instinct activated, Thornton's hands found the next rung. The climb resumed, agonizing and slow, until finally they reached the bell platform. It was a small space, barely large enough for two men to stand, the massive iron bell suspended above them by a wooden crossbeam, blackened with age and weather. The bell rope passed through a pulley system before descending to the chapel floor below, a mechanical simplicity that had called the faithful to worship for over a decade. Silas maneuvered Thornton to the edge of the platform, positioning him where the maximum number of people would be able to see clearly when dawn came. The master's body had become a puppet, moving where directed, responding to pressure and commands but exhibiting no will of its own. His eyes still tracked movement, still showed awareness, but the light of personality had been replaced by something more primitive, the fundamental consciousness of a creature that knows it is dying but cannot comprehend why. The rope work required precision. Silas had practiced knots for weeks, testing them on fence posts and barn rafters, ensuring he could tie them quickly and securely, even with cold, tired hands. He fashioned a noose first, a traditional hangman's knot that would tighten under weight but not slip prematurely. This went around Thornton's neck, positioned carefully to avoid interfering with the rope already there but tight enough to take the full burden of what was coming. Then came the more complex work. Silas needed to secure the rope to the crossbeam, create the right length so that when Thornton dropped, the fall would be sufficient to ensure the neck broke rather than allowing slow strangulation. There was no mercy in this calculation, only the practical recognition that a quick death made a cleaner display than a protracted one. The message was in the stitched mouth and the public placement, not in extended suffering. As he worked, Silas found his mind drifting to unexpected places. He thought about the first day he arrived at the Blackwell estate, purchased and transported like livestock, numbered and valued and assigned sleeping space in quarters that smelled of old hay and despair. He thought about the first time Thornton struck him, a backhanded blow across the face for moving too slowly, delivered with casual indifference as if swatting a fly. He thought about all the small deaths that accumulated over 7 years, the daily erosions of dignity that left a person standing upright but hollow inside. And he thought about what came next, after the bell rang and people came running and discovered what hung in the tower. There would be pursuit, certainly. Posses would form, dogs would be loosed, rewards would be posted. The territory had laws about such things, laws that drew bright lines between acceptable and unacceptable violence. Laws that protected masters while criminalizing enslaved resistance. Silas had no illusions about how this story would be recorded in official accounts, whose version would be believed, whose humanity would be acknowledged. But he also knew that stories had lives beyond official records. They spread through communities that existed in the margins, told in codes and songs and whispers. Tonight would become legend among those who needed to believe that power could be challenged, that silence could be broken, that the order of things was not as permanent as it appeared. Whether he survived to see those stories spread or died in the attempt, the message would persist. That mattered more than his individual fate. The knots completed, Silas tested them one final time. Thornton stood swaying at the platform's edge, the noose around his neck, his face a mask of blood and thread and terror. His breathing had become irregular, short gasps followed by long pauses, the body beginning to shut down from shock and blood loss and oxygen deprivation. He would not last much longer even without the drop. But the drop was necessary, the final theatrical element that would ensure this night lived in memory. Silas positioned himself behind Thornton, his hands on the master's shoulders. The moment had arrived, the point past which retreat became impossible. He thought one last time about his grandmother, about her stories of justice that waited patiently for its moment. He thought about Colleen and Dominic and Evelyn, scattered across the estate, watching for signs, ready to run when the bell sounded. He thought about all the nameless others who had suffered under systems they could not change, who had died without ever pushing back, whose voices were lost to history. "This is for them," Silas said quietly, "for every voice you silenced, every person you broke, every life you spent without thought. This is the bill coming due, Mr. Blackwell. And the currency is your own body displayed where everyone can see what happens when patience transforms into action." Imagine standing on that platform, feeling the wind push against your back, knowing that the next moment would define everything that followed. Would you have the courage to push? Would you believe the message was worth the cost? Or would you hesitate, allowing doubt to creep in, questioning whether this act was justice or merely violence wearing justice's mask? Silas did not hesitate. His hands pressed forward, firm and decisive, and Thornton Blackwell stepped off the platform into empty air. For a fraction of a second, he seemed to hang suspended, gravity not yet asserting its claim. Then physics took over. His body dropped, the rope went taut, and the force of the sudden stop yanked the crossbeam violently. The bell, disturbed by the vibration traveling through its mounting, swung slightly. The clapper struck iron with a sound that rolled across the prairie like thunder, deep and resonant and impossible to ignore. Once, twice, 3 times the bell rang before settling back into stillness, the rope now hanging straight and still, a dark shape silhouetted against the chapel window's glow. Silas climbed down the ladder quickly, his movements efficient despite exhaustion. The work was done, the message was delivered. Now came the harder part, escape into a territory that offered few hiding places for a man whose description would soon be known by every sheriff and bounty hunter within 300 miles. At the chapel floor, he collected his canvas bundle, tucking away the bloody needle and remaining thread. Evidence, but also a kind of trophy. Proof for himself that this night had happened, that he had not simply imagined an alternative to endless submission. He extinguished the altar lamp, plunging the chapel into darkness broken only by starlight filtering through windows. At the door, he paused for one last look back. Thornton's body hung in the tower, visible only as a darker shadow against darkness, but unmistakably there, unmistakably deliberate. The sewn mouth would be discovered at dawn, examined by people who would struggle to comprehend what they were seeing, debated by those who needed to maintain the fiction that such things did not happen, could not happen, in a civilized territory. But it had happened. The evidence swung gently in the tower, moved by wind that carried the scent of coming frost. And Silas, who had been silent for 7 years, had spoken in a language that could not be misunderstood or dismissed. He stepped out into the night, closing the door behind him. The prairie stretched vast and dark in every direction, mountains rising as black shapes against a star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, freedom waited, if he could reach it. Somewhere behind him, the Blackwell estate would soon erupt in chaos when the bell's toll reached ears trained to recognize alarm. The clock struck 9:30, though Silas could no longer hear it. He moved quickly away from the chapel, following the creek bed back toward the estate, where he would collect supplies and weapons cached earlier in the day. Cullen, Dominic, and Evelyn would already be moving, each taking their planned route, scattering like seeds that might take root elsewhere, or might be crushed before sprouting. Behind him, the bell hung silent now, its work done. And beneath it, Thornton Blackwell faced his final congregation, mouth sewn shut, unable to preach or command or explain away what his life had wrought. The collapse was complete. The order had inverted, and when the sun rose on Summit Ridge Chapel, a new story would begin, one that would echo far beyond the immediate horror, one that would force questions about power and resistance and what people become when pushed past the point of endurance. The gathering storm had broken, the confrontation had ended, and now came the aftermath, when the territory would have to decide what this night meant, whose version of events would be believed, and whether the message written in needle and thread and tolling bell would change anything or simply add another chapter to the long, bitter history of those who fought back against impossible odds. Silas ran into the darkness, his breath crystallizing in the cold air, his heart pounding with fear and exhaustion and something else, something that felt almost like hope. Behind him, the chapel waited for morning and discovery. Ahead of him, the unknown stretched vast and dangerous and alive with terrible possibility. Dawn broke pale and cold over the Colorado Territory, the kind of morning that turns breath to mist and makes the mountains look close enough to touch. The sky shifted from black to purple to gray, each shade revealing more of the landscape, more of the frost-covered prairie, more of the small wooden chapel that sat alone on the ridge like a question mark punctuating the horizon. At the Blackwell estate, the household stirred slowly, reluctant to leave warm beds for the bite of late October air. Genevieve rose first, as she always did, her routine unbreakable even on mornings when frost painted patterns on the windows. She moved through the house, lighting lamps and stoking the stove, her movements efficient and practiced. It was only when she reached the kitchen and found it unusually quiet that the first thread of unease began to wind through her morning. Colleen was not at her station. The breakfast preparations had not been started. The coffee pot sat cold and empty. Genevieve's lips thinned with irritation, her first assumption being laziness rather than absence. She strode to the quarters, her boots crunching across frost-hard ground, and threw open the door without knocking. The space was empty, not just vacant, but deliberately abandoned. Bedrolls were missing. The few personal items that had accumulated over years of occupation were gone. The shelf where Evelyn kept her hymnal sat bare. The corner where Dominic stored his spare shirt showed nothing but wall. Even the smell was different, the residue of human habitation already fading into the scent of cold dirt and old wood. Genevieve stood in the doorway for a long moment, her mind struggling to process what her eyes reported. Then she turned and ran back to the main house, her voice sharp as a blade cutting through the morning stillness. "They're gone! All of them! Someone wake Mr. Blackwell immediately!" The household erupted into controlled chaos. The sons tumbled from their beds, pulling on clothes and boots while demanding explanations. Genevieve swept through rooms, cataloging what else might be missing, what other betrayals the morning might reveal. It took nearly 10 minutes before someone thought to check whether Thornton had returned from his Saturday prayers. His horse stood in the barn, unsaddled and munching hay contentedly. His coat hung on its usual hook. But the man himself was nowhere to be found. The sons exchanged glances, unease transforming into something harder and more urgent. Their father never varied his routine. He was always home by 9, always in his study by 9:30, always predictable as sunrise. The chapel, the eldest son said, his voice tight. He must have stayed there overnight. Maybe he fell ill, maybe... He did not finish the sentence. All three men were already moving, saddling horses with fumbling hands, their breath coming quick and shallow. Genevieve stood on the porch watching them ride out, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her face carved from stone. She knew, in the way that people sometimes know terrible things before evidence confirms them, that her husband would not be coming home. The ride to Summit Ridge Chapel took 12 minutes at a gallop. The horses' hooves threw up clods of frozen earth, their breath steaming in the cold air. As they approached, nothing seemed obviously wrong. The building stood solid and unremarkable, its door closed, its windows dark now that morning light had made the interior lamp unnecessary. But when the eldest son dismounted and pushed open the door, the smell hit him first. Blood and fear and something else, the copper salt scent of violence that lingers in enclosed spaces. He took 2 steps inside before his eyes adjusted to the dim interior and traveled upward to the bell tower. His scream brought his brothers running. All three stood frozen in the doorway, their minds unable to process what hung above them. Thornton Blackwell's body swayed slightly in a draft, turning in a slow circle that presented different angles of the same horror. His face, even from this distance, showed something wrong, something unnatural in the line of his mouth. The youngest brother vomited in the doorway. The middle brother started praying, words tumbling out in a panicked stream. And the eldest, after a moment of paralysis, turned and ran for his horse. "Get the sheriff! Get everyone! Sweet merciful God, get help!" By noon, Summit Ridge Chapel had become the center of a gathering storm. Sheriff Hoskins arrived with 3 deputies, their faces grim as they examined the scene. A doctor was summoned to examine the body once it was lowered, his hands shaking as he tried to maintain professional detachment while documenting injuries that defied his understanding of typical frontier violence. The stitches were counted, 22 in total, each one precise and evenly spaced, the work of someone who understood needle and thread, who had taken time to do the job properly. The horsehair was identified, traced to the type used in saddle repair. The knots in the rope were analyzed, their competence suggesting experience with livestock and rigging. Word spread across the territory with the speed of wildfire. Riders carried the news to neighboring ranches, to mining camps in the foothills, to trading posts where men gathered to hear the latest developments. Each retelling added details, subtracted others, transformed the facts into something larger and more symbolic. By evening, half the territory had heard that a master had been killed by his slaves. By the next morning, the other half knew that his mouth had been sewn shut and his body hung like a Sunday sermon. Posses formed immediately, men volunteering with enthusiasm born from fear and outrage. If one master could be killed, if the order could be challenged so dramatically, then no one was safe. The comfortable assumptions that governed their lives had been revealed as fragile, dependent on compliance that could evaporate like morning frost under the right conditions. But the fugitives had vanished. Silas, Colleen, Dominic, and Evelyn had scattered in 4 directions, each following routes planned over weeks of whispered conferences. They had supplies cached, contacts among communities that existed in the margins, knowledge of terrain that most settlers never bothered to learn. The posses rode out with dogs and guns in righteous fury, but they were chasing ghosts through a landscape that swallowed secrets. 3 days after the discovery, a bounty was posted, $500 for information leading to the capture of any of the 4. Another $500 for their return, dead or alive. The territorial governor issued a statement calling the killing an act of savage barbarism and promising that justice would be swift and severe. Newspapers in Denver ran illustrations imagining the scene. Artists who had never visited Summit Ridge Chapel drawing dramatic renderings based on second-hand descriptions. Yet underneath the official outrage, other conversations were happening. In quarters across the territory, in the spaces where those without power gathered, the story was told differently. Here, Thornton Blackwell's sewn mouth became a symbol of every voice silenced, every complaint dismissed, every plea for mercy ignored. Here, the bell that rang when his body dropped became a call to awareness, a reminder that the order of things was maintained by force and could be challenged by force. A song began to circulate, its origins impossible to trace, its lyrics carrying meanings that shifted depending on who sang them. The melody was old, adapted from spirituals that had traveled from the Deep South, but the words were new, speaking of bells that ring for justice and mouths that speak through silence. Overseers and masters who heard it dismissed the song as primitive nonsense. Those who sang it knew better. Weeks passed without capture. The initial fury of the pursuit gave way to grim persistence, then to frustrated resignation. The 4 fugitives had disappeared into the vast western landscape as if they had never existed. Some claimed they had been killed by hostile tribes in the mountains. Others insisted they had made it to California or Oregon, where populations were large enough to hide in. A few whispered that they still lived nearby, watching and waiting and inspiring others to consider what might be possible. The Blackwell estate struggled to continue. Genevieve tried to maintain operations, but workers were suddenly scarce. No one wanted to labor in a place marked by such violence, where the master's death hung over everything like a curse. Within 6 months, the main house stood empty, the cattle sold off, the land absorbed by neighbors who spoke in quiet voices about bad luck and divine judgment. Summit Ridge Chapel was abandoned entirely. The congregation found other places to worship, unwilling to pray in a space where such horror had occurred. The building fell into disrepair, its windows breaking, its door sagging open, weeds claiming the ground where Thornton Blackwell had walked so confidently to his weekly penance. But the story did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger with time, each retelling adding layers of meaning and interpretation. Abolitionists in the East seized on it as evidence of slavery's inherent violence, pointing out that only a system built on cruelty could produce such desperate resistance. Pro-slavery advocates used it as proof that some people were too savage for freedom, that order must be maintained at any cost. The truth, as always, was more complex than either side wanted to acknowledge. What happened in that chapel was neither simple villainy nor pure heroism. It was the result of systems that crushed human dignity, of power exercised without restraint, of patience stretched past its breaking point. It was what happened when silence was forced on people who had voices, when humanity was denied to those who possessed it fully, when the order of things became unbearable to those forced to uphold it. 5 years after that October night, a traveling preacher passing through what remained of Summit Ridge encountered an elderly woman living alone in a cabin at the edge of former Blackwell land. She invited him in for coffee, and, as they talked, she mentioned that she sometimes heard singing late at night, voices carrying across the prairie from no identifiable source. "What do they sing?" the preacher asked. "Old songs," she replied, "songs about freedom and justice and bells that ring in the darkness. Sometimes I think I recognize one of the voices, someone who used to work the Blackwell place before the trouble. But that can't be, can it? They're all gone now. dead or disappeared? The preacher had no answer. He finished his coffee and continued his journey, but the story stayed with him. Years later, he would write about it in his memoirs, adding his own interpretation to the growing mythology. By 1860, as the nation slid toward civil war and questions about slavery moved from abstract debate to armed conflict, the story of Summit Ridge Chapel had become legend. It was referenced in speeches and sermons, used as evidence by those arguing all sides of the question. The facts had been polished smooth by retelling, the rough edges of individual humanity replaced by symbolic significance. But for those who sang the songs in quiet voices, for those who lived in the margins where official history rarely ventured, the story meant something simpler and more profound. It meant that resistance was possible. It meant that silence could be broken. It meant that the order of things, no matter how permanent it appeared, was maintained by people and could be challenged by people. No one ever confirmed what happened to Silas, Colleen, Dominic, or Evelyn. They vanished into the vastness of the Western Territories, becoming rumors and shadows and occasional unconfirmed sightings. Perhaps they found freedom. Perhaps they died trying. Perhaps they lived ordinary lives under new names in places where no one asked too many questions about the past. What remained was Summit Ridge Chapel, slowly collapsing into the earth, its bell still hanging silent in the tower. Travelers sometimes stopped to examine the ruins, running their hands over weathered wood and trying to imagine what had happened there. Local residents warned their offspring to stay away, claiming the place was cursed or haunted or simply too sad to visit. But on certain nights when the wind blew just right, people swore they could hear a bell ringing across the prairie. Not the regular peal of calling the faithful to worship, but a single, resonant tone that spoke of endings and beginnings, of justice delayed but not denied, of voices that refuse to be silenced no matter how many stitches are applied. The story of the slave who sewed his master's mouth shut and hung him from the church bell became part of the territory's dark folklore, a tale told to warn or inspire depending on who needed the lesson. It joined other stories of frontier violence and resistance, of systems challenged and sometimes changed, of people who refused to accept that their voices did not matter. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of that October night in 1852. Not the violence itself, which was tragic and terrible regardless of its motivations. Not the escape of 4 people into uncertain freedom, but the simple, undeniable fact that when Thornton Blackwell's body was discovered with his mouth sewn shut, everyone who heard about it understood immediately what the message meant. Silence, forced on others, eventually demands an answer. And sometimes that answer comes written in needle and thread, announced by a tolling bell, and remembered long after the individuals involved have disappeared into history's vast, unknowable distances. The prairie wind still blows across Summit Ridge, the mountains still rise against the western sky, and somewhere in the scattered stories and songs that persist in communities that remember, 4 names are whispered with a mixture of fear and admiration, their actions debated but never forgotten, their challenge to the order of things still resonating more than a century and a half later. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.